Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology for revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else you need for your A-level and GCSE sociology studies. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Laura Way. Hi, Laura. How are you?
Hello, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Very good, thank you. And you're joining me today to help out to understand functionalism for all those students out there who are starting maybe sociology courses for the first time and having a look at the functionalist perspective.
Yeah.
So thanks for helping out. So we're going to start right from the very basics, okay? We're going to assume no knowledge at all. So Laura, when you're introducing functionalism, how do you start? What's the very basics? What's it mean?
In terms of the very basics, I would start explaining functionalism by thinking about the kind of broader approach that functionalism sits under in terms of sociological perspectives. So I would introduce to students the idea of functionalism as a macro perspective and as a consensus perspective as well. And what we mean by that when we say a macro perspective, we are talking about a perspective in sociology that is taking a bird's eye view of society. It very much looks top down onto society and it's interested more so in the kind of structures and institutions of society. That might include things like education, the family, religion, media. And macro perspectives are interested in how that kind of structure and those institutions shape us, and the part that those structures and institutions play in society. So that would be one way that I would introduce functionalism, is through it being a macro perspective, as opposed to a micro perspective, which perhaps is more focused on the day-to-day interactions between individuals.
If people had listened to the episode a few weeks ago, we talked about the difference between positivism and interpretivism. So in what you're saying, functionalism falls into that positivist macro theory, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much. Yeah. So if you've got a macro perspective, you tend to find macro goes hand in hand with positivism, whereas the micro goes kind of hand in hand more so with interpretivism. So yeah, functionalism, macro, and positivist as well.
Great. And then you just mentioned it's a consensus theory. So should we tackle that one? What does that mean?
So in terms of some of the perspectives in sociology, and not all of them, and sometimes students have said to me previously, well, where does this perspective fit in? Is it a consensus perspective or is it the opposite, which is conflict? And some of them don't necessarily fall into this. But we can distinguish between some perspectives which are conflict, and then we tend to have functionalism, which is consensus. And the idea of a consensus perspective is a perspective that emphasizes things working together within society. So with regards to functionalism, one of the ideas within functionalism, which comes from Durkheim, who I'm sure we'll talk about more in a minute, but he talks about the organic analogy and society working like a human body, and all these different parts of society having kind of roles to play, and they need to work together. They're interdependent. And in that sense, then you've got a consensus, things working together for the benefit of wider society, as opposed to perhaps a conflict perspective, which emphasizes some kind of clash of interests, perhaps, within society.
Yeah, I've been saying to my students who've just started it this week that if you think about what's happening in society at the moment, we need consensus. You know, we need the healthcare system to work with the government, to work with the education system, to work with families. So all those agencies working together. Now, if they can do it, that's a big question. But if they can do it, that's what we're talking about in terms of that kind of organic analogy, isn't it?
Yeah, very much.
And should we move on to the theorists then? So you just mentioned Emil Durkheim, possibly the best known of the functionists. But what are his main theories? What was he all about, Durkheim?
Well, Durkheim, so really, I always kind of say that he is a bit of a founding father in a sense of sociology. He was one of the kind of original social scientists to really try and push sociology as a scientific kind of subject. And he kind of comes across sometimes to me as a bit of a worrier. So sometimes when I used to introduce Durkheim to students, I used to talk about the things that he was worried about in society. He was very much worried about rapid social change. And obviously the time when he's alive, it's kind of 1800s. He's a French sociologist. And, you know, the context that he's working in, you've got things like political unrest, things with regards to industrialization, these big changes happening in society. And he was worried about what that was going to mean for society. So for him, sociology in a way was going to kind of help us in moving forward. And one of his ideas, as I've mentioned already, is that of organic analogy, this idea of society being like a human body with different body parts working together. And if something doesn't work, obviously, then the whole system might not work either. And he, as a sociologist, he did promote positivism and a positivist approach to research, believing that there were these social facts that were out there that we could, that we could examine, and we could look at how these impact us and how they impact kind of day-to-day life and society. And one of his big studies that he is known for was his work on suicide as well. And I know for A-level students, crime and deviance it's one of the compulsory ones. It always tends to be one of the popular ones as well that students enjoy. And his work on suicide is quite influential there in terms of how we think about something that had traditionally been seen as something that should have been studied, I guess, within the realms of something like psychology. And, he wanted to take the work of suicide and have a look at it from a more sociological point of view.
Yeah, and he does actually talk about rapid social change being one of the reasons behind that, doesn't
he? Yeah.
And you mentioned there as well social scientists. So for functionalism, sociology is very much a scientific subject, isn't it, or a scientific approach?
Yeah. And that's interesting as well, because positivists hold themselves up very much as that kind of scientific approach, whereas interpretivists, I'm sure, would also argue that they're being scientific, but just in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
So positivism, I guess, is what we think of when we tend to think of traditional science, the very stereotypical idea of science. And for positivists, they wanted to take the kind of scientific framework that was used with the natural sciences and literally to kind of lift that over to the study of humans and the study of society. And there's particular ways of doing that. So one thing in particular that's associated with positivism is the hypothetico-deductive model, which I always say, if you can remember that, then get that in on an essay answer. And it's this kind of scientific way of studying where you have a hypothesis and then you take a deductive approach where you set up your research to test the hypothesis. And there's lots of other things as well that you have to be, being scientific, you have to make sure that you're objective and using, empirical data and things. And that's quite in contrast then with interpretivists and their way of approaching it. But Durkheim was very much a supporter and promoter of the positivist side.
Yeah, and trying to find that objectivity and reliability important as well. And actually, you mentioned kind of his work on suicide. It took that very much scientific approach to statistics, didn't it, rather than the empathetic interpretivist approach?
Yeah, very much. The method alone that he uses there with the statistics is interesting in itself, because Durkheim in that study, he's not just using statistics and just presenting it as using statistics as a secondary kind of method. He promotes this use of statistics as being what he calls the comparative method. So the way that he gathers up these statistics and kind of checks them against each other for looking for different variables and things like that. And in a way, I don't think he necessarily uses this expression, but some people have described it as such, where he's taken the method of doing a lab experiment, but applying it to statistics. And it's kind of referred to as a thought experiment. And sometimes when you try and explain that to students, it's like he's doing an experiment and doing the way that you would do an experiment, but it's all happening in his mind. And he's, so that's quite interesting, that kind of way of doing it.
I think that's really important because, some students have been sending me questions asking, how is sociology scientific? But I think, like you said, that hypothetico-deductive model, starting with a hypothesis and drawing towards a conclusion, is basically stealing the methodology of the scientist, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, Durkheim, I'm sure students have already started to pick up on that name. Who are the other kind of big hitters within the world of functionalism, would you say, Laura?
Ones that might crop up time and time again. So you've got functionalists like Parsons, Talcott Parsons, you've got Merton, and I think aside from Durkheim, Parsons features quite heavily in different topics that are studied on A-level, for example, and Merton particularly on topics to do with crime and deviance with his strain theory.
Yeah. And if students have already started to look at particularly someone like Parsons, you've already mentioned a lot of functionalism was written a long time ago. It might sound quite outdated, maybe even sexist, quite traditional conservative ideas on how society should work. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Yeah, very fair. Functionalism, and especially something like Parsons with things like the warm bath theory, and were heavily criticised by feminists for the way that they view gender roles. And there is even the idea as well within some functionalist thinkers that the reason why we have these gender roles between men and women, with the woman as the housewife and the male breadwinner, is because they are actually based on biological differences. And I find that really interesting, the fact that you have this, sociologists, and they're then starting to talk about biological differences and bring that into their analysis. But obviously feminists are not happy about that. Yeah,
I was actually quite surprised because teaching that in the last couple of weeks, I said someone like Parsons came to the conclusion men should go to work because they're bigger, taller, stronger. Women should look after the children because they give birth. I was quite surprised a few students nodded along and said, well, that's true, isn't it? So, even if you think the ideas are quite outdated, I guess there was some process of thought behind those conclusions, wasn't there?
Yeah, and it's still, even though we do say these things are outdated, some of these ideas are still very prevalent. And that's one of the good things about sociology, and helping us kind of think about those things a bit more.
Yeah, and it's a good starting point, I think. It's a good platform to learn the other theories, because functionalism was one of the original. You mentioned Durkheim was a founding father. It's quite important to understand functionalism before you look at the newer theories, isn't it?
Yeah, very much. And for the most part, I mean, functionalism, we would say, is largely now, though, outdated. And a lot of the other perspectives that students would come across are the ones that tend to be more of use, I guess.
Yeah, more
or maybe not of use, but yeah.
So we mentioned a couple of the big words. Okay, we mentioned about being macro, positivist, consensus. A word that students will stumble across quite a lot in relation to functionalism is this idea of meritocracy, or a meritocratic society. Do you mind just explaining what that means?
Yeah, so a meritocratic society is the idea that, I guess, where you get to in your life is going to be based on your own merit. So how well you do, the kind of job that you go into will be based on your merit, your ability, your talents. And there is, to explain that, there's a pair of functionalists, Davos and Moore, and they talk about this in relation to education. And they talk about meritocracy and role allocation, and the idea that we go into education and technically we have equal opportunities. Everyone, starts at the same kind of starting point, which I say that with a smile on my face because I find that very hard to believe. But yeah, I'm still told, that is the case by a lot of people. So you go into education, and education is almost like a kind of sorting mechanism. So through doing your different subjects, through being assessed by teachers, your ability and your talent will then guide you into the kind of most suited job. So in a sense, then, inequality is fair because we have an unequal society because not everyone is able to do everything. People are only able to do certain things. So some people are more suited to going into politics and becoming the prime minister, whilst others are more suited to doing other jobs. So I think maybe, I don't know whether that's just complicated it even further, but that's what I always think of when I think of the meritocracy.
It's a controversial theory, isn't it?
I know, even just saying about the prime ministers getting there because they're the most.
Just one of the phrases you mentioned, Davis and Moore, they also talk about this organisation of human capital, that people all end up in different positions. And they say it's due to meritocracy. Your hard work and effort will get you to the top, and a lack of hard work and effort will push you down to the bottom. So I'm sure you can work out, listeners, that's very controversial if we think about who actually gets to the top in terms of gender, ethnicity, social class, etc.
Yeah. And it's very, again, it's signalling perhaps one of the criticisms of functionalism as being quite simplistic, because just looking at Marxism, feminism, straight away you start to see how it's not necessarily a meritocratic society. There's all these different intricacies that impact who gets to positions of power, for example, and who doesn't.
Yeah, I think Marxists even use the phrase "the myth of meritocracy," don't they, to criticise that functionist idea. Other key terms that you'd associate with functionalism then? So we've talked about positivism, macro, consensus, meritocracy. Are there any other words that you really associate with the functionist perspective?
I think some of the other key ones, things like collective conscience or collective consciousness and social solidarity, I think tend to be ones, particularly when introducing functionalism, would be ones that we would speak about. Do you want me to say a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say they seem to have a lot of words that kind of mean the same thing. So unity, solidarity, collective consciousness, togetherness, they're all on that same sort of theme, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They are very similar. And I think sometimes, we can confuse them as well. So I know that commonly with collective consciousness and social solidarity, students often blend them together, and it is because they are that similar. But maybe it's trying to think about collective kind of consciousness as our way of thinking, and that being shared, collectively, and then social solidarity more so the feeling of being part of a group that then comes from that collective way of thinking.
I mean, if students want to apply it to what's happening at the moment, Boris hasn't used those words, but he is asking for a collective conscience, isn't he? That we all need to work together on this. We need to keep our distance from each other. We all have to have the responsibility of masks, and the only way we can tackle this is that collective conscience, that kind of working together, if you like.
Yeah, thinking about it in the current context as well, and relating that to Durkheim's work around when he talks about crime and deviance and how crimes often kind of bring us together and reinforce our way of thinking, even though COVID obviously is not a crime, though maybe COVID itself is deviant, but in a way, it is, we could say that it is kind of bringing us together a bit. There was this kind of shared sense of, initially, oh no, what is happening, how terrible, we can't let this continue. But whether or not that's still the case now is another matter.
Yeah. There's another word that students may have come across. Durkheim's often associated with this idea of anomie. Do you mind explaining what that means? Because it's kind of written in a lot of textbooks, but not fully explained.
Yeah. Whenever students used to ask me about that, I used to just try and sum it up as anomie being a state of normlessness. So norms are the kind of accepted ways of behaving. So anomie is when those accepted ways of behaving have kind of disappeared and broken down. So, for example, we might say in the case of a riot, a riot might be then an example of anomie because people are engaging in technically unacceptable behaviour and how they should be behaving is not happening. So I think maybe that might be a nice way of thinking about it.
So both a society can be in a state of anomie, but an individual could be in an anomic state as well, couldn't they?
Yeah, and that relates to the work on suicide as well, because you can get in that kind of anomic form of suicide too. So yeah, on an individual level as well as societal as well.
Yeah, I guess if someone's detached or not following the norms, the expectancy of society. Do you think, Laura, that functionalism still has a place in sociology? We've said it's kind of outdated, it's written a long time ago. Some of the ideas like meritocracy are quite controversial. Do you think it still has any credence at all?
Personally, I certainly don't think it's as relevant as other perspectives, and I understand why functionalism is still on teaching syllabus and, in understanding where sociology came from and where other ideas built, from that. But sometimes it does feel a bit like we're teaching the history of sociology more so than perhaps something that's, necessarily really relevant today. Yeah.
But as you said, I think it's quite interesting to see where sociology started from. If you go from functionalism all the way up to, say, postmodernism, you can see there's quite significant transitions as we go through the stages, certainly. So let's finish with that then. So if we say that functionalism is heavily criticised, what are the major critiques of the theory?
Well, you've already picked up earlier on, the things to do with the way that gender's seen. And certainly feminists have criticised functionalists for the way that they see women and the way that they've understood gender roles and, bringing in that biological aspect. Functionalists and Marxists, straight away you've got that conflict compared to consensus idea. So, together they would argue that functionalists overemphasise the consensus in society, and Marxists broadly would say that functionalists don't consider the impact of class and the inequalities, as being negative, because obviously for functionalists, everything's serving a positive function, even inequality. And also as well, Marxists would say that there's no engagement with really the impact that capitalism, has on us. One of the other big perspectives, obviously, postmodernism just tends to say that nothing is relevant other than postmodernism, because it's all talking about a type of society that no longer exists. So functionalism is a modernist perspective. It talks about a modern society. It believes that we are in modernity, whereas postmodernists believe that we're no longer in that kind of society anymore. Aside from that, when you look at more the kind of social action interactionist perspectives, they would very much criticise functionalism for focusing too much on the macro and not thinking about the micro, not thinking about the day-to-day and the everyday kind of interactions between people. And other than that, students sometimes pick up on the similarities between functionalism and New Right.
Yeah.
And even though the New Right is technically a political perspective, it's still a perspective that we utilise in sociology. And there is some similarity, there is some overlap, but still the New Right are also somewhat critical of functionalism, because in their eyes, things aren't really happening the way that they should be, particularly around the family. So
yeah. Those more traditional, perhaps even conservative ideas, there is a parallel between the two perspectives, isn't there?
Yeah. And, the functionalism talk a lot about the nuclear family and how that's the most kind of beneficial for society. New Right would also agree with that, but New Right don't believe that it's the most dominant form of family anymore. They feel that obviously that's changing and that's problematic.
So let's just recap. So if you're studying at the moment, I would say key terms, I've just written them down as Laura's talking. So positivism, macro theory, consensus, meritocracy, anomie, and sociologists to look up: Durkheim, Parsons, Davis and Moore. That's quite a lot to go on, isn't it? That's quite a lot of theory for students to look at.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today, Laura. Really, really appreciate it. And I'd like to welcome you back if you'd like to do another one of the theories. We're going to look through all the different perspectives in the future. So if you're happy to come and talk about something else, that would be great.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
What's your favourite perspective, Laura? That might be one.
Feminism.
Feminism. Okay, I might grab you back for feminism. Even actually feminism, I might break it down into different types of feminism, different strains of feminism, because that's a big area to tackle. Thank you again for your time today, Laura. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.